This week's guest, Lori McMullen's novel, Among the Beautiful Beasts, is based on the early life of Marjory Stoneman Douglas. Here she talks about the importance of Douglas's work to save the Florida Everglades.
Marjory's work on the Everglades is a microcosm of what needs to be done on a global level. And, I wish she was still around now.
Welcome to Writers' Voices with Monica and Caroline. I'm your host, Monica Hadley, and with me is my co-host and mother, who's still wonderful since the last time I said that, Caroline Kilborn. Hello, Mom.
Hi. So it's a spring day today, and a little bit of rain, but we can handle that, and we hope that it's a good day for everybody who's listening.
Why don't you introduce our guest this morning?
Oh, it's my pleasure. The book we're talking about today is Among the Beautiful Beasts, and it's a novel by Lori McMullen. And it's a very interesting book because I learned quite a bit about Miami that I didn't know before, and it's quite interesting. I think anyone who reads this will enjoy it, no doubt. Lori grew up in an unincorporated Dade County outside of Miami, and she now lives with her family in Chicago. She's a graduate of Dartmouth College and Harvard Law School, and her short fiction has appeared in the Tampa Review and Slushpile magazine. Among the Beautiful Beasts is her first novel, and it's kind of a historical novel in a way. You'll find out about it as we talk about it, but it's very interesting. Welcome to Writers' Voices, Lori.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here with you.
So, is this your first published novel?
It is. It is my very first published novel. I can be very honest with you and tell you that I had 2 failed attempts at novel publishing before this one. But I think this book was just waiting to be written, and that's the reason.
It's based on the life of Marjory Stoneman Douglas, and I think for a lot of people that name is familiar, but they don't quite know why.
Right.
So what would you tell them?
Sure. I mean, anybody who grew up in South Florida and, went through the public school system in South Florida knows the name Marjory Stoneman Douglas. She was a tireless advocate for the Florida Everglades. She is kind of a fixture in South Florida history. But very little is known widely about her earlier life and what led her to become an activist and care so passionately about the Everglades, because she's not from Florida. She's actually from Rhode Island, and she grew up in the Northeast. So, she came to Florida, she found the Everglades, and she became an activist and became passionate about it. She didn't grow up there feeling that way. I think a lot of people might, beyond Florida, be familiar with her name from the tragedy that took place at the Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in 2018. And so I think for a lot of people, the name sounds familiar and they're not sure why. And that is, unfortunately,
right. And
where
that's
lot of people
Parkland shooting that you're referring to.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right.
And
that's right.
Partly why the name of the high school is really so closely aligned with that is because the students, the survivors who became activists, really looked to Marjory Stoneman Douglas as a role model.
Yes, absolutely.
And is that part of why you decided to write this book?
No, actually, the shooting occurred really as I was finishing the first draft of the book. I mean, I had just completed the first draft, and the tragedy happened, I think, about a week later. So,
oh wow!
I came to Marjory. Yeah, I came to Marjory before that. But there's such an interesting connection there. I mean, the fact that the school is named after her. I go into a little bit in the book, but in 1916, Marjory went to Tallahassee to the Florida State Legislature with a few other prominent women, and they were arguing to the legislature that women should have the right to vote in Florida. And they were completely ignored. Not just the legislators didn't do anything about it, but they blatantly dismissed the women and their appeal. And, almost 100 years later, in 2018, a few days after the Parkland tragedy, the surviving students traveled to Tallahassee to advocate for gun restrictions. And before they had even reached Tallahassee, the legislature had already voted along party lines to reject advancing a bill that would have banned large capacity magazines and assault rifles. So there's this eerie similarity 100 years later of trying to present to the Florida legislature these motions that were just ignored. But I like to think that, like Marjory, as I go into in the book, as she found her calling from the hardships of her youth, and that led her to her future passion and her future advocacy and reason for her work, I think that she'd be very proud of the students, of the surviving students, and their call to activism as well.
She had a pretty rough life, didn't she?
She did. As I read about her early life, I was struck by how there were such moments of happiness and beauty in it, but overall, it really was quite a difficult childhood and young adulthood. She lived with both her mother and her father in Rhode Island and was happy. She adored both of them. Her mother was a musician and a pianist and a singer and just filled their house with music and love. And her father, he read stories to her. I think he was her first introduction to books and literature, and they would read each evening together. And her mother suffered a kind of abrupt mental breakdown in which she believed that Marjory's father was going to try to steal Marjory from her. So to prevent that from happening, she ripped Marjory from this very loving, safe home and the mother took Marjory to her own parents' house in Taunton, Massachusetts, where, again, she lived with loving grandparents and an aunt there, but it was not warm the way her house had been. And her mother spent time in, an institution when her mental illness became great enough. So she suffered the loss of both her mother and her father in very different ways. It continued as she got older. I don't think it's giving anything away to say that her mother did eventually, pass away, and that was very difficult for Marjory. And as part of her coping, she became involved in a marriage with a much older man who was a bit of a swindler and a con artist, and was not entirely forthcoming with Marjory about his intentions and his activities.
Now, it seems like her mother's family kind of supported her mother's idea that her dad was this evil man. Is there,
yes.
Do you really understand why they did that?
As I thought about that question, I think it is actually something a lot of people can relate to. I think her mother's family's dislike of the father wasn't so much a dislike of him as a person. I think they feared for Marjory's mother's stability and comfort in that marriage. Marjory's father was an adventurer. When she was young, before the parents split up, he traveled many times out west to kind of find his fortune. And I think that her family just didn't trust him to be able to provide for his family the way they expected a man to be able to at that time. I think they believed he jeopardized their security by constantly going out west and looking for something greater. So I think it was less a dislike of him as a person and more of a distrust of his choices.
Well, they probably blamed him perhaps for their daughter's decline too, mental decline maybe.
Yes, absolutely. I didn't go into this too much in the book, but in some of my research, I did learn that before Marjorie was born, her parents, they met at a boarding house in Minnesota, I believe, and they spent quite a bit of time in the early years of their marriage in Minnesota, I believe with his family and his mother, who was quite a domineering presence. And I think that frontier life and the stress of the relationship with the mother-in-law probably contributed to Marjory's mother's feelings of instability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I was interested to know, how in the world did you find out all these details, though, about her early life? I mean, were there books written about that?
Yes. I read a really fantastic biography of her called Voice of the River. And, Marjory, it was not completely an autobiography. She contributed to it. And it's interesting because it really very factually goes through the events of her life all the way, from the very beginning through her later years. She lived to be 108, like through her later years.
Wait, 108?
108, yes. She passed away in 1998. She was 108 years old. And that's what I think is one of the things that's so interesting about her. She didn't really get going in her activism until midlife. My book focuses on her early life and kind of addresses the question of what brought her to that point. But she had a whole other lifetime. And so this book the Voice of the River book, unlike a lot of her writing that I've read, like her seminal work, River of Grass, which is about the Everglades and is very lyrical and lush and descriptive, this biography was very factual. This happened and went through her life chronologically. And that was really the most helpful source of information for me.
Is this the first time you know of that somebody has written a fictional narrative of her life?
That I know of, yes. I did look into that when I first got the idea because I didn't want to do something that had already been done. And as far as I could tell, no one else has written a fictional account of her life. And
was there some, kind of seminal moment that said, yes, this is what I want to write? Something that caused you to say, I'm going to spend the next X number of years of my life writing about this woman?
Well, it's kind of a long answer, so bear with me. But I think, as I mentioned before, I had 2 attempts at a novel that didn't really work. But I've had a couple of short stories published. And when I was thinking about my writing and what I enjoy writing and what seems to be effective in my writing, it became clear that writing about Florida and writing about place and setting is really what makes me passionate and what I think creates some of my better work. So when I was thinking, okay, I'm going to try to write a novel, I realized that it had to take place in Florida, and it had to be a novel where the setting was as vibrant and alive as any of the characters in it. So once I came to that conclusion, it wasn't a far leap to find Marjory. I had actually just finished reading Paula McLean's Circling the Sun, which is historical fiction about a woman named Beryl Markham, who was one of the first female aviators to cross the Atlantic in the early 1900s. And I closed that book and I said, I want to write a story about a heroine like this. Like, I was just so excited about that book and so excited that it was historical fiction about a woman in her own right and not a woman whose story is being told because she was married to somebody famous. So combining that with this realization that I really love to write about Florida and setting, once I had those 2 pieces in place, Marjory became the obvious person. And when I started to do a little research into her early life, I realized there's a lot here. I mean, this could make a much more interesting story than I even thought possible. So.
Well, that it was. But, what's interesting to me was the development of Miami. I had no idea. I mean, you just don't think about that. And I think anybody who lives there should read this because I think they would find it extremely interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I learned some stuff about the history of Miami, too, that I had not really realized, especially that the creation of Miami Beach was almost entirely man-made. I mean, it had been a little sandbar, and they started dredging from the Everglades and bringing land from the Everglades to the beach and pulling sand up from the bottom of the bay to create Miami Beach. And, it was very intentionally created as a tourist destination. And, the Dixie Highway was built to bring the Northerners directly to this piece of land that had just been constructed, which I think is something a lot of people don't realize. Miami Beach is obviously built up now and very developed, but it's hard to believe that the land itself hadn't existed.
Right. That's what amazed me. It really did.
So Marjory Stoneman Douglas is known for basically saving the Everglades. Is that an accurate thing to say?
I mean, yes, I think it is. She is one of the first people living in South Florida to realize that the Everglades was a precious resource. I mean, there's a ton of history and backstory about the development of the Everglades and, advertisements in newspapers up north selling land for tomato farms and sugarcane. And, there was this move to completely tame the Everglades, to turn into farmland. It was seen at the time in the 1920s of the Florida land boom. It was seen as wasteland, and how could it be exploited for, financial gain, agriculture. And, Marjorie was one of the first people to take a look at it and say, there's more to it, that this is an essential part of the Florida landscape. And we need to think about how, creating these canals and redirecting the water, what is that doing to our ecosystem? So she was really one of the first people to see that and to start bringing that to people's consciousness. And she had this platform in the Miami Herald. It goes into a little bit in the book about how her father started the Miami Herald newspaper, and she worked there, and she continued to work there and have her own column. And as she got older and became more involved in social issues and environmental issues, she used her column in the newspaper as a platform to raise awareness about these things. So she started writing about the Everglades in her column in the newspaper and started raising awareness. And in 1947, she published River of Grass, which is just this beautiful, beautiful dedication to the Everglades. And that's the same year that the Everglades became a national park. And, years later, I think in the 60s, she founded Friends of the Everglades, which exists still and is, one of the foremost organizations fighting for the preservation of the Everglades and awareness of how important it is to Florida. She really was one of the first to sound the alarm bell that the Everglades needed people's help and couldn't just continue to be destroyed.
You're listening to Writers' Voices with Monica and Caroline, and our guest today is Lori McMullen, author of Among the Beautiful Beasts, which is the story of Marjory Stoneman Douglas.
How long did it take you to write this book?
I think it took me about 2 years, including research. I'm a planner and that's true in my writing as well. So I did the research, I outlined, I kind of did that thing where I took pieces of construction paper and papered my wall with the timeline of the story. And then I started writing. And I'm also a pretty slow writer. I have this bad habit of kind of editing as I go, which just makes for a painfully long process. But it also means that when I finally do get to the end, it's not in bad shape. So that's how I write, but it does take a while. So I think start to end, it was 2 years. And then I, got some writer friends to take a look at it and give comments and begin editing from there. Yeah,
there were so many details, about this woman's early life and everything and the people in it that I can see why it would take some time to weave it all together.
So you set out to write about her as a heroine and what she did, and very much Florida being a part of it. Although the first half of the book is about her life before she came to Florida.
Yeah. So
at what point how did you decide what to focus on in this story?
That's a good question. think when I actually first sat down to write, I think one of the very first things I did was write the scene where she gets off the train in Florida and for the first time and meets her dad. And I wrote that scene, and then I didn't know where to go from there because it became obvious that wasn't the place to start. And I realized that to tell her story and to really understand her, you needed to see her childhood first. What struck me about her is the amount of sacrifice that even from a very young age she was expected to make. And this idea that for her, love was about giving so much of yourself to somebody else who needs it. And I wanted to show her development through from being a very young child to being a young woman and a married woman, that continuously she was expected to sacrifice her own needs for the needs of others. And that once the reader saw that and understood that, when she gets to Florida and she recognizes the same exploitation and just gutting that the Everglades is going through, that's how she's able to relate to the Everglades. And that's why she feels such a connection to it. So that's maybe a long way of saying I saw Florida and Miami as the heart of the story, but I realized that to understand her and why Florida was important to her, we needed to go back to the beginning and see her childhood.
Mm-hmm. Right, because it all weaves together. That's right.
Yeah.
Well, someone may come to this book, interested in the history of an activist or of the Everglades or something, but I find from the very beginning, you just really know this little girl and young woman, this character, and her life. You feel I felt so attached to her and so like caring about what was going to happen to her.
I'm glad you felt that way about her, because that was part of what I wanted to do, is just make her relatable and help create a character and or not create her, she exists, but illuminate a character that people could relate to and see pieces of themselves in. So I really wanted to do that. So I'm glad you felt that way.
Now, were you able to speak with anyone who actually knew her?
I was not. I've been in contact with some people from Friends of the Everglades, and I do think there are people still in that organization who knew her, because 1998 is not that long ago,
right,
when she was still alive. But I haven't personally talked to anybody. No.
And she didn't have children, right?
She did not, and it was a conscious decision. She did not have children. I think part of her kind of awakening was that she realized it was expected of her, but she didn't actually want it. And that was a hard thing for her to acknowledge and accept.
And she didn't have brothers or sisters, so there's no need. So, because would have asked, well, what do her, her descendants or relatives think of the story? But there's really no one.
Right, exactly, yes. I mean, I do think she had a great network of friends in Miami, but no direct relatives.
That's interesting. I wonder, if she had children or had been in a caretaking, role as a mother, stepmother, aunt or something, whether she would have had the energy left over to do the things that she did.
Right. I mean, it's a good question. I think a lot of us can feel that way. Like, what would we do if we didn't have all these other obligations?
Yeah.
And I think that's part of what I found really inspiring about her was her. It's courageous, I think, to recognize that she wanted to devote herself to her writing and to the Everglades. And I think of writing and raising children to be kind of similar activities, that the creation of this thing that didn't exist before, and you put it out there in the world and hope for the best, and there are a lot of parallels there. So the fact that she didn't have children, but she knew she wanted to devote her life to writing and then eventually the Everglades, I think, it's a similar feeling, even if it's not exactly the same thing.
Now, in the book, once she finally does reconnect with her father, he's very supportive of her writing because he owns a newspaper and he hires her. Do you think it was that smooth, really? Did she get that support from him?
I think that he was happy that she came. I think when he learned about her situation with her husband, I think he was concerned about her. So I believe he was happy that she came. But there's, I think, so much history between them and so many unanswered questions that, as far as I can tell, they didn't address, that it couldn't possibly have been entirely smooth. I think he was a very intellectual man, but he had never gone to college, and that there was a little bit of resentment directed towards her that she was able to go to college and really get an education, whereas he wasn't, and he probably felt like that held him back from some of the things he had wanted to do. I think also when she was little and her mother had taken her away, he had promised that he would come get her. And it's unclear whether he ever actually did. There's some suggestion that he tried and was turned away by the mother's family. But as far as Marjory knew, he hadn't come to see her like he had promised she did. So, when she finally does reconnect with him in Florida, there's all this tension and these unknowns, and I think a lot of questions about the strength of their relationship and their love, and that aren't easily answered. But as far as her writing, I do think, I think he did support her writing, though.
How did you know about that promise? Was that something that was in the biography of her, The Voice of the River, or how did you know that her father had made that promise?
That's a very good question. Without going back and looking, I can't say for 100% sure whether I made that up but there was definitely something. I'll put it this way. I don't know if the book explicitly says. I could go back and look. I don't know if it explicitly says, but it's certainly her biography suggested that he was going to come back, or she wanted him and had asked him to. And this is part of the problem with writing historical fiction. It's like the fact and my imagination, the lines get very blurry.
Yes.
Which is part of the fun too. But so I can't say for sure without going back and looking.
Now, did she keep journals or personal letters that you were able to use in your research?
Yeah, I was able to find on the University of Miami website, they've got archives in history, and the Miami Herald has archives that go way back. And so between those things and the book, I was able to find a lot of her columns were editorial columns in the newspaper, and very personal, or, a lot of her personality in them. She often just published poems, which was a little unusual for a newspaper, but that's how she wanted to get her thoughts across. So, there was enough out there to put together and get a sense of herself and her thoughts.
Has anyone ever published like a collected writings of hers?
I don't know. She wrote a lot of stories in newspapers. I mean, she didn't just go from like a journalist to an activist. I mean, she really, I think her first love was writing. And so, she had a lot of short stories published in magazines, and that's how she paid for the construction of her cottage in Coconut Grove. She would sell another story to a magazine and get the money and, do a little more building on the house. And, and piece by piece, room by room, the house got built. But I don't know if there's an actual collection where it's all put in one place. That would be, I think, a very interesting thing to see, especially to see her progression, as a writer, and the transformation as a writer. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Lori, why don't you read from Among the Beautiful Beasts for us?
Sure, I'd love to. I think I'll start right at the beginning, and maybe set it up by saying the story is told in alternating chapters where, there's some short, kind of intense chase scenes that happen, and then it goes to longer, more reflective chapters. So I think what I'll do is read right from the beginning, it begins with one of the chase scenes, and then a little bit from the first, more reflective chapter that goes into her childhood. So, okay. West of Miami, 1920. I can't see the mosquitoes, but I hear them coming. They swarm through the darkness in a cloud of buzzing night song, eager to feast. This is their warning, their war chant, yet somehow I am still startled when they descend. In a cloud of 1,000 or more, they force their sharp suckers through the veil of my clothes, then my skin, and they pull. Pull and pull with bacchanalian fervor, delicate bodies straining until my blood drains away, a millionth of a drop at a time. This is love, I think. This is the only kind of love I've ever known. Around me, beyond the roar of mosquitoes, the swamp gurgles and slurps, a nocturnal commotion that is stranger than any I've ever heard. If I stare long enough into the dark, alligator eyes start to appear, luminescent pairs of pinkness, sprinkled across water so black it might as well be the abyss. They are so patient, those eyes, so preternaturally calm. I am 30 years old and at the edge of the civilized world with an impossible choice. Remain trapped where I am or step into the wild, wild unknown. An unknown that teems with bird calls and howls, where freedom is rabid and dogged and as relentless as the water that flows and flows forever south to the bay. My head throbs, my fingertips buzz, and as the mosquitoes gorge on what's left of myself, I realize that I have no idea what to do. And then, Providence, Rhode Island, 1896. We used to walk, my mother and I, over the sleeping streets of Providence, Rhode Island. Her hand was nearly as small as mine and softer than the gardenia petals on the bush near our house. I held onto her hand more and more tightly as night came on. The air on those evenings smelled of pine and soot, of salt off the sea and drying horse dung. Windows, like stars, lit up with haphazard timing. There was, all around us, a sense of brief otherworldliness, as if the crisscrossing streets of the city had lifted and settled again on a faraway planet. Look, I'd say to Mama, and we'd catch glimpses of our neighbors' lives being lived before the curtains were drawn. We knew most of the people inside those houses, but there was a thrill to watching them unaware. Sometimes Mama would gossip, nothing too scandalous, but still things that I, at 5 years old, shouldn't have known. Does Mr. Carson really have another wife in Colorado, Mama? I asked when she told me about the people in the brick house on the corner. That's what I heard, love, Mama answered. I wonder how he keeps their birthdays straight. I'm sure he manages somehow, she said, squeezing my hand. With these secrets tucked in between us, we'd roam the neighborhood, laughing at stories that might have been true and delighting in the closeness of each other. Mama didn't stop to talk to anyone during our nighttime walks. Even if she saw someone she knew, she nodded and smiled but never slowed down. This made me feel very special. Surely whoever was on the receiving end of Mama's quick greeting looked at me and knew I must be important. That one, Mama would sometimes say out of nowhere. She'd stop walking and kneel, pressing her pink cheek to mine. Which one, Mama? I'd follow the line of her finger through freckled night stars. She'd point over the trees at the brightest white one. That one, Marjory. That's me. I'm your North Star. Yes, Mama, I'd say, believing. We'd walk past my school, past Grandmother Stoneman's vine-covered house, past my bedtime. No matter when we arrived home, though, Papa would be there, candles lit and Lewis Carroll in hand. Good walk, he'd ask, lifting me as I nodded, suddenly taken over with sleep. Then Papa would carry me upstairs and read to me until I drifted away in his arms.
And that was Lori McMullen reading from Among the Beautiful Beasts, which is a historical novel about the life of Marjory Stoneman Douglas.
You know, I was thinking the fact that her father welcomed her so, when she finally did connect with him, proves to me that he really probably did try to get in touch with her through those years, but was rejected by, her mother's family because he always had that desire to get her back.
I like to believe that too.
In the book, he has letters that he had sent, or birthday cards he had sent to her over the years that were rejected. Was that something that was true, or something that you?
Yes. No, that was
okay.
Yes, I believe so. Yeah.
Wow. And is that something that's like in the archives, those actual cards?
I'm not sure. I don't know. I don't know. And you know, I think, I'm not entirely sure, but I think her house in Coconut Grove there's a movement to preserve it and almost even turn it into a writer's retreat. Yeah, wouldn't that be wonderful?
Yeah.
And I don't know if some of those things are in her house still and on display, but something like those cards very well could be.
Wow. So tell us a little bit more about River of Grass and how, what you took from that book that inspired you.
Yeah, well, River of Grass is her book about the Everglades. And, when I read through it, what blew me away is the passion that she writes with and the amount of knowledge that she goes all the way back through the ecological history to the beginning of the formation of Florida and goes on, and in such lush detail. And all I kept thinking as I read it was that, this is the work of a woman in love. Like the language, she just sounds so besotted with the place and enamored. And then you learn so much, about oolite rock and the limestone and the way that the water flows and the differences between the dry season and the wet season and what that means for the entire South Florida ecosystem. And then when you get to the end, she's very blunt about, the Everglades is dying. This is its 11th hour. And if we don't take action now, it will be gone. And I think that call to action is that much more powerful because she spent so much of the book lovingly describing this place so that even if you've never been there, you can appreciate the uniqueness of it and the richness of it. And I actually think it is a great model for, a greater climate change conversation. That Marjory's work on the Everglades is a microcosm of what needs to be done on a global level. And, I wish she was still around now. I think that the ability to become so intimately aware of a place and then acknowledge that it's threatened is a very powerful tool.
So can you expand on that a little more? Like when you say that what she did as a model for climate change now?
So this gets a little goofy, but I really believe this. So to me, and part of the point of my book is I believe that she felt called to protect the Everglades because she had a very personal connection with it. Not just that she spent time there, but that she saw herself in it. She saw the Everglades as an equally vulnerable place like she was, an exploited place, a place that was expected to just keep giving of itself for the benefit of the city growing around it, just like she throughout her life had been expected to keep giving. And what that develops is not just a concern for the land or a caring, but an actual empathy that you can relate to it on a really deep, she could relate to it on a very, very deep level. And I wonder if there's a way to compel people to do the same thing in other environments and with their own personal histories. I think of a cancer, right? If somebody goes through a cancer scare and they realize the threat of this encroaching malignancy, can you take that awareness and that knowledge and use it to empathize with an endangered ecosystem? or, even the death of a loved one, which every single person on earth goes through. But you realize that there was this unique life on earth, and it's not going to be there again. It is lost forever. And there's nothing you can do about that. And if you can take that same feeling and see it in, an endangered animal or an ecosystem that is about to be irreversibly destroyed. And so that's what I mean when I say I think it's a model. I think if people can look within their own experiences and create an empathy for the earth beyond just the feeling of obligation or it's the right thing to do or I should do it, but to actually connect on that deep, deep level, I think it could be an effective way to create change.
That makes a lot of sense.
It does, indeed.
Yeah. You're listening to Writers' Voices with Monica and Caroline. Our guest today is Lori McMullen, author of Among the Beautiful Beasts. Now, Lori, you attended Harvard Law School.
Yes.
And how is your training as an attorney or your law school? How has that played out in your writing career?
Well, there's the obvious answer, which was that because I'm no longer a lawyer, I can be a writer. But I think there is more to it than that. I loved law school. I did not love practicing law. But one of the things I loved about law school was understanding the power of language and the nuance of language and how a tiny little word or a comma can affect the interpretation of a very significant law. Or, if trying to persuade a jury or a judge to see things your client's way, that kind of writing, it really made me have a whole new level of appreciation for the power of language. And I think I've taken that with me from law school into writing. So beyond just showing me what I didn't want to do as a career, I think law school also, just really elevated my belief in the power of language.
I think that is also a very good concept, because sometimes people think you go to schools, particularly professional education, to learn how to be a certain profession, but a lot of people don't end up being that or doing that work.
Right.
But they take that and it influences them in other ways. So it's not, there's maybe a tendency to think, oh, you're wasting your education if you're not a lawyer. But no, you're just using it in a different way.
Yeah. But I think you're absolutely right. I mean, on a personal note, like I did struggle with the guilt of leaving the practice of law. And, my family had sacrificed a lot for me to go there. I'd taken out a lot of loans and, I felt guilty not practicing law. But I also realized that it was unsustainable for me. And as a woman, as a mother, I have 3 daughters, and part of me worried that I was not setting a good example for them by leaving the practice of law. And they've just been wonderful, because I've realized now that by pursuing my dream, I've actually set the best example possible for them. And, they're my biggest supporters, and 2 out of the 3 of them love to sit down and write stories themselves. And so I do feel like my fear of setting a bad example for my girls was completely unfounded. So,
and
yeah.
I think I saw in the acknowledgments in your book that your mother set a good example for you too.
Oh, she did. She did. I mean, she did buy me that Smurfette poster. I remember it so clearly. It was Smurfette holding a briefcase going into a door that said president on the front, and the caption on the poster was "Girls Could Do Anything." And I took that to heart. And I know that, she didn't, kind of like Marjory's father, and she didn't go to college, but she did everything she possibly could to make sure that I did. And yeah, I credit her with all of this. So
there's so many details in here. I just can't imagine how you kept track of all that. It was really amazing writing.
Thank you.
Well, you talk about how you planned everything out and did the timeline and so forth, and I'm sure your legal training had something to do with that as well. That's partly why you maybe write that way.
Yes, I think it probably is.
When you sat down to write, did you know exactly, like, okay, we're going to cover from this period of her life to this, and these are the parts of her life that I want to include in the book, in the story? Or did that come a little more organically as you wrote?
I would say those things became clear as I was doing the research and creating the timeline and plotting it out, that I began to see connections before I sat down to write. And I knew from doing the research that I wanted to end the story before she really got into her activism. I was able to determine that from the research and my studying beforehand. But writing is such an adventure, and with as much planning as I did, once you actually sit down and start putting the words down, it changes and it takes on a life of its own. And I was able to see things that only could have become visible through the writing process, and make connections there. And, this is a very small thing, but it is the doll that her grandmother gave her when she's living with her mother's family in Taunton was actually named Jean, that was in her biography. So she had this little doll that she wasn't sure she actually liked or not, but she thought Jean was a cute name, and she would keep the doll. And, and later on, when she's an adult and she's in Paris and she's working for the Red Cross, there's a statue right outside of her hotel, and it's Joan of Arc. And in French, it's Jean. And the connection between the doll that she got and the statue, and that I hadn't seen doing the research. It wasn't until I wrote it that I realized there's this connection there, with this doll that gave Marjorie a sense of security and freedom, and then the statue of this woman who's, a trailblazer in her own right. And so those were two actual facts. And to make the link there even stronger, I added into a middle portion when she lives in New York City, and she goes to the Met, to the art museum. I added an element of where she, is really transfixed by this painting of Joan of Arc, to kind of link these things that were already existing in her life. So that kind of thing I couldn't possibly have planned out beforehand, but as I wrote it, I could uncover these connections that, from a literary perspective, it seemed like were worth digging into a little further.
Oh, absolutely. Now, was her father's newspaper was the Herald?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Is that the current Miami Herald, or are they unrelated?
Yeah. No, it was the current Miami Herald. I mean, it's
wow.
Obviously undergone a lot of changes in ownership. But yeah, he founded the Miami Herald, and the rival newspaper at the time was the Metropolitan, and one was a morning paper, one was an evening paper, and they had rival printing presses, like who could literally have the newest, fastest, biggest printing press to get the paper out. Yeah, and I actually, I hadn't known that about the Miami Herald before I started doing the research. I didn't know that connection was there. But seeing as how that newspaper showed up at our door every day for my entire childhood, I thought it was really cool. So,
yeah. And, the fact that she was writing for it at a time when maybe there were some other female reporters back in the early 1900s, but not so many. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Exactly. When her father first offered her a job at the paper, he offered her the position of the society pages because, she's a woman and that's what she would be expected to write about. She had to advocate for herself to, be trusted to write anything more substantial.
Now, there's a part in the book where she makes up some society news. Did that really happen?
That really happened. I definitely, I don't think I could have made that up. I mean, that happened. It was, slow in the society scene in Miami at the time, for a couple months there. So she just invented stories, which, when you think about it, really jeopardizes the quality of the entire newspaper. So I don't think her father was too happy about it.
I mean, did she make up names too? Did she make up names?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so at least she didn't make up things about real people.
That's true.
Well, that was good.
Yeah. Right.
And was she ever, physically at risk for her activism? Was she threatened? Was she?
I don't know if she was actually physically threatened. I do know, I don't go into it in this story, in this book, because I really felt like there were only so many things I could capture well. But she was, as part of her activism, really outspoken about the living conditions of African Americans in Miami at the time, and became one of the most outspoken proponents of improving the living conditions and the quality of the housing and the sewage. And, there was a big difference from one part of the city to the other based on what people look like. And she was one of the first to begin making noise about that and trying to get it changed. And, I think there was a lot of resistance to that. I don't know if there was actual physical threat, but I do think that was very difficult for her to promote. I don't think it was well received across the city. And, she struggled to make that argument. So yeah, wow. she really, yeah, I didn't think that I could effectively address everything in the book, but I was blown away by the breadth of her passions and the causes that she took on.
Would you say
she's most,
that she ended up having a happy life, from so much misery early on?
I do. I mean, I think once she was able to be honest with herself about what she wanted and what she didn't want and made the choice to be on her own and to write, I do think she was happy. I think she had an incredible network of friends and connections in Florida throughout the years. I think she was driven and just inspired by her work. I do think she was happy.
And one of the first connections she made in Miami was with the wife of William Jennings Bryan. Did I get that right? Who was,
yes,
was he Secretary of State?
Yes.
The U.S. Secretary
right.
of State. How much of an how much of an influence was she? What was her name? Mary Elizabeth? Was that?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think she was a pretty big influence on Marjory. I mean, she saw something in Marjory, and I believe that Mrs. Bryant was the person who allowed Marjory to believe she could have an opinion, advocate for it, and possibly see change. I don't think Marjory believed that before. She'd been involved in the women's suffrage movement in college, but not to any real degree. And I think she hadn't believed in the power of her own voice before meeting Mary Elizabeth and seeing this outspoken woman who I think Marjory believed that she was the real force behind her husband's success. And, Marjory went with Mary Elizabeth to Tallahassee in that anecdote I told you before when they argued before the legislature about women's rights. That was Mary Elizabeth's doing. And at her invitation, Marjory went to Tallahassee. And I think that was eye-opening for Marjory and really showed her own potential and caused her to believe in the power of that potential.
Mm. So, Lori, we just have a few minutes left. This is your first novel. Was it difficult to get published?
Yes. It's not an easy process. It really isn't. It's you finish the book and you think, great, I've done it. And you realize it's just the beginning. But I had a wonderful agent who really believed in the book. She is not someone who represents very much fiction, but she read the book and she believed in it. And, she sent it around. It was, I would say, maybe a year of sending the book around. And then She Writes Press was interested in it, and we went from there. But it's not easy. There's, so many wonderful writers out there and so many unknown writers. And I think that's the thing. Trying to get a publisher to take a leap of faith on an unknown writer is a big ask. Mm-hmm. But it's, it was a long but rewarding journey. So I can honestly, as cheesy as it sounds, it really, really is the realization of a lifelong dream. So, worth the wait.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you. Thank
you
so much.
What are you working on next?
Well, I guess if I say it out loud, I have to do it, right?
Right.
I am indulging another longtime passion of mine, which is William Faulkner, and I am audaciously toying with the idea of writing a modern version of one of his novels. So that's currently what I'm playing around with. I just love the richness of his work and love the idea of playing with his themes and ideas, but in a modern context. So.
Okay, now I'm going to have to, take a look at Faulkner and see, because, I've heard of him. I've probably read him at some point, but hadn't thought about him in years. Yeah. What are his most famous books?
As I Lay Dying and The Sound and the Fury are probably his two most famous. He's also written Absalom, and Sanctuary, and a whole bunch of short stories. And I find them so rewarding to read because they are very difficult to understand, but almost like reading Shakespeare. Like once you get it, it's so funny and insightful, and the story's gripping, and all of that is in there if you can just unlock the key. So. Right.
Oh, and there's so many layers.
Yes. Yes.
To the language, and
yeah,
I could see why that appeals to you, because your writing has layers too.
Thank you.
Oh yes.
You're welcome. Well, I think we're about out of time, and I want to thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. It really has been so much fun. I appreciate it.
And Mom, do you have some closing words?
I do. We all have a past, a family history, and our own mistakes and regrets. We also have a future. How many days are left, we don't know, but we can try to enjoy life where we are in time. And that's what this lady did.
Oh, it's beautiful.
Well, thank you, and see you all next week on Writers' Voices.